Welcome to the Leadership Zone. I'm your host, Sheila Walsh, Leadership Development Specialist, Coach and Researcher. Hello. Yesterday I did some work with Roffey Park Institute and it was around management essentials and I was facilitating/training. So one of the things that we cover in the programme, but that always comes up in regards to inclusion, bias, self-esteem, all of that really good stuff, is feedback and how you should give feedback. And one of the key things about feedback is we need to be really careful how we ourselves are giving feedback, because both us and the organisation has a vulnerability. Because if we are unconscious in our feedback and we indicate something that is related to the protected categories of identity that exists within Irish law, UK law and European law, and we do it with the best intention, we can get ourselves in trouble. So what we really need to think about when it comes to feedback is what to give feedback on. So we need to give feedback on behaviour, not identity. So we need to talk about what they're doing, that we need to be changed, that we need them to change. We need to talk about the effect it's going to have on us, how we feel about it, then what our preference would be, and then why that would work. So for instance, I might say, when you shout at me, it makes it really hard for me to listen and I feel overwhelmed. I'd like you to speak calmer so that I can hear what you're saying. So that's me running through it. But if I wasn't doing behaviour, I might say, you always shout, it's very annoying, you're aggressive, I'm fed up of that. Which isn't an effective way to give the feedback, because there's a couple of things. One is we aren't naming the behaviour, so we said they are. The other is that we aren't talking about the effect and how we feel. And the other reason that it's not effective is we aren't telling them the replacement behaviour that we want and why that would work better. Now here is where it gets entangled with legislation, is if I'm giving feedback to someone and I'm unconscious of my bias, which loads of us have bias. Bias is about staying safe in the world. It's about not having to think about crossing the road every time, but knowing that it's a threat. It's about putting people into buckets so that we can make faster decisions. And sometimes that bias is helpful because we're using previous experiences and we can make informed decisions. But in terms of discrimination, we can't differentiate between the bias that's helpful and the bias that's discrimination. And we all have both biases. Our brain needs them. We function that way. No need to be ashamed of them. That's how it is. However, when it comes to discrimination, we are responsible when we work in a place of employment not to be perpetrating discrimination, because there's laws and legislation to protect people. And where feedback can go really wrong is when we give feedback to somebody based on their identity, especially if their identity is protected under law. Let me talk about that. An example might be where somebody says to you in a male-dominated environment, you need to be less of a woman. That would actually fall under gender discrimination, okay? When actually the feedback might be something like, I find it really difficult when you're upset, and it would be really helpful for me if you can tell me what's happening for you before you're upset. For instance, I'm using a real scenario that I've heard of, that I was involved in, so I'm not presuming anything. It was a real scenario. Another example might be telling someone who's a member of the LGBTQ plus community that they need to be careful and not disclose their sexuality. Now you may, whether you're a part of the community or not, you may think you're being helpful, but that feedback technically is discrimination, because you are actually commenting and asking them to be different in relation to a protected category. It's called different things under different laws, but under European law generally we kind of have 9 that slightly differs country to country. So feedback has to be about behaviour, but it actually has to be about behaviour that's relevant to the work performance, not behaviour that relates to their personality. So if it is about how they communicate and why that's not effective, if it is about how they complete a job, if it is about how something is happening that directly impacts their work, and you're talking about the behaviour, that more than likely will keep you outside of that the discrimination area. But if you are giving feedback that relates to their identity in any way, if you comment on the way they present themselves and it has a cultural or racialized relationship, if you comment on or you give feedback about them being less of themselves in some way, rather than about specific behaviours that are directly related to work performance, you're going to have a challenge there. And one of the areas that's really challenging is sometimes we give feedback because we don't know that it's discrimination. And sometimes we also give feedback because we don't know that the issue actually lies with the norms in our organisation and not with the individual's behaviour. So if I give feedback about what dressing professionally means, right? Because I have an idea of what professionalism means in this industry. And it's the norm. So I think this is normal feedback to give. But actually, the feedback demonstrates how the industry or organisation has normalised some form of discrimination and dressed it up as professionalism. We are actually discriminating. So it's really important when we give feedback that feedback is about work-related behaviour and that we are clear that we are not somehow perpetrating some kind of discrimination. What I will say is the majority of times I've experienced any discrimination in the workplace, unfortunately, has often been by people with the same shared identity, and often it being given to me as a word of advice in some way. Regardless of whether you are the same identity that you're giving feedback about that may be considered discrimination or not, you're actually still responsible. So whether I am of the identity that's giving feedback, that I'm giving feedback about, or I'm of a different identity, discrimination applies to all of us. We cannot discriminate against each other regardless of whether we share the identity or not. It doesn't make us less something. Women are not less sexist when they're giving feedback to other women necessarily. People within the LGBTQ community aren't necessarily not going to give homophobic feedback to other people. It happens because it's within systems that these things exist. So within your management and your feedback, you need to know A, what legislation is, B, that your feedback is directly related to work performance and it isn't perpetrating some kind of expecting them to assimilate or perpetrating some kind of discrimination. And in any management or leadership role, this is the technical stuff you need information about. Like if you work in any job, you need technical knowledge usually. But in management, you do need technical knowledge about your obligation in those roles in your place of work. And there is some technical legislation that applies. So it's just really important to know that your feedback needs to be about behaviour. You need to express its effect. You need to express your feeling. You need to say what you want, and you need to say why you want the new behaviour, how that would work better. And you need to know that the feedback you're giving is actually valid feedback rather than your preference through unconscious bias or through assimilation with your industry or your organisation. Lots of things happen that are normalised, that actually aren't okay in legislation, but also aren't okay human being to human being. They get in the way of performance. So just because something isn't being called out as bad doesn't mean it's good practice. And if you're in a management or a leadership role, we need to be thinking about good practice, and we need to ensure that we have the capacity to check ourselves and to improve our practice as leaders and managers in giving feedback, in how we give feedback and in what we give feedback on. And not just because of legislation, that's protect yourself, protect your organisation, that's important. However, beyond that, leadership and management requires good practice like many other things. And it is not good practice to be giving feedback on certain things and to be giving feedback about people rather than about behaviours. It is good practice to talk about feedback that is directly related to work performance, that you have checked doesn't on some level require the other person to assimilate, or you aren't somehow perpetrating discrimination in your feedback. And it's important for you to think about how you're delivering that feedback. If you want to talk about it any more, or you want some support in your workplace or in your own practice, you can contact me on info@sheilawalsh.com or on my website at sheilawalsh.com, and we can have a conversation. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Zone. We can continue this conversation over on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is @SheilaWalsh1, or at LinkedIn, you'll find me under Sheila Walsh. To book a free consultation to discuss your leadership needs or the leadership development needs of your organisation, simply visit my website www.sheilawalsh.com and book a free leadership consultation. I look forward to hearing from you.